She stood at my gate just before sunrise, demanding the code with the kind of confidence you only see in people who believe rules don't apply to them. I didn't know her, but she insisted the HOA required full access to every property, including mine. When I refused, her smile faded into something colder, something that made the hair on my neck stand up. Later that day, my security system sent me an alert. 3 failed attempts to unlock the gate. 3 tries I never authorized. That's when I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a threat. And what happened after that 3rd attempt, well, she never saw it coming. Before the conflict began, life in our little suburban enclave felt safe, even predictable. I had moved in with the hope of quiet mornings, green lawns, and neighbors who waved as they jogged past. My house, modest but cozy, had always been my sanctuary. A place where weekend barbecues and late-night reading sessions felt untouched by the outside world. The streets were lined with perfectly trimmed hedges, and the HOA board meetings, I assumed, were harmless formalities, more about community gardening contests than any real power over daily life. Yet, beneath the pristine lawns and polite smiles, rules lurked that I barely noticed, tiny clauses buried in pages of bylaws about gates, codes, and community access. At first, these regulations seemed like nothing more than technicalities, easy to ignore, like background noise in the harmony of neighborhood life. But I would soon learn that the real danger wasn't the rules themselves. It was the people who wielded them with a quiet, relentless authority, the neighbors who could turn oversight into obsession, and the HOA that treated every minor deviation as an opportunity for control. A sense of unease began to creep in, subtle at first, a shadow in the otherwise sunny routine, hinting that the peaceful life I loved was about to be tested in ways I couldn't imagine. The sense of unease that had crept into my mornings quickly became a full-blown storm as the HOA began to tighten its grip on every aspect of my life. At first, it was small things. Letters slipped under my door about a mailbox that was allegedly too high, a bush that supposedly encroached on the community aesthetic. Even the color of my front door. I laughed at the absurdity, thinking it was all bureaucratic posturing, until the fines started arriving. A few $100s here, a few $100 there, each one justified with vague language about non-compliance with community standards. Then came the notices about my gate. Apparently, the HOA expected me to provide the access code to every board member, along with anyone they deemed a visitor of interest. I refused, knowing my security system was meant to protect my family, not grant free entry to strangers in suits. That's when the harassment turned more personal. One afternoon, I found my mailbox had been pried open, the contents rifled through, a warning letter tucked inside, warning me of consequences for continued noncompliance. Cameras I'd installed for peace of mind suddenly recorded people lurking around at odd hours, checking locks, counting vehicles, as if they were cataloging my every movement. Friends visiting would remark on the strange intensity of the scrutiny, their eyes widening when I explained the situation. Fellow homeowners complaining about my fence height, or the angle of my holiday lights. Neighbors whispering about how the board might handle someone like me. Each new email from the HOA felt like a challenge, a gauntlet thrown, each one more absurd than the last, escalating into a psychological battle where I was constantly on edge. The tipping point came when a neighbor, previously polite but clearly emboldened by the board's favoritism, demanded access to my gate, citing some obscure clause about community safety inspections. She smiled as if she owned the place, confident that my refusal would make me look unreasonable. When I denied her, my security system recorded 3 failed attempts to enter my property. That moment was the spark. The quiet, simmering tension exploded into a full-blown confrontation. Overnight, my notifications pinged constantly, and I felt trapped in my own home, under the watchful eyes of people who seemed to have an unspoken vendetta. I realized this wasn't just about rules or aesthetics anymore. It was a battle for control, for assertion, for the power to make me feel unsafe in the place I loved most. I began documenting everything. Dates, times, letters, camera footage. Each incident building a growing dossier that would later prove invaluable, yet at the moment, it only heightened the stress. The community that had once seemed like a haven, now felt like a stage. Each neighbor an actor playing a role in the escalating drama, each board meeting a theater of intimidation, where I was the reluctant protagonist. The absurdity of some rules. No garden gnomes allowed, restrictions on certain flowers, fines for leaving a hose in the driveway, clashed with the invasive enforcement that bordered on obsession. Calls from the HOA, vague but threatening, left me dizzy with confusion and anger. The lines between petty oversight and harassment blurred, until I could no longer distinguish one from the other. Yet, I held on to a stubborn sense of defiance, a determination not to surrender to the escalating absurdity. Every knock at the door, every unsolicited inspection notice, every whispered complaint from neighbors became a test of patience, endurance, and creativity. I found myself walking a tightrope between compliance and resistance, trying to avoid giving them any leverage while quietly plotting a way to turn the situation to my favor. And then, just when I thought the tension had reached its peak, a new notice arrived. One that would change the entire game. It wasn't about a bush or a mailbox this time. It was a direct order demanding immediate disclosure of my gate code, under threat of unprecedented fines and legal action. I stared at it in disbelief, heart pounding, knowing that whatever choice I made next would escalate the conflict beyond anything I had endured so far. The quiet, almost invisible pressure of weeks had now turned into an overt challenge, a gauntlet thrown in broad daylight. My mind raced. Comply and lose control of my home, or resist and risk everything. And that's when I realized the game had shifted. The stakes had doubled. And the next move could change everything. For both me and the people who thought they could dictate the rules of my life. The anticipation hung heavy, a palpable tension that made each passing moment feel like walking on the edge of a cliff. I knew the confrontation was inevitable. The only question was how far it would go, and whether anyone in that neighborhood would ever see the true cost of the board's obsession with control. Each day brought new signs that the HOA's obsession with my property wasn't slowing down, but escalating, testing my patience, my resolve, and my nerves. I began to notice patterns. Surveillance during unusual hours, neighbors suddenly appearing where they had no reason to be, and cryptic references to bylaws that seemed tailored to intimidate rather than regulate. Every small act, leaving the trash out too long, parking a guest car slightly off, adjusting my outdoor lights, was met with immediate notice, and the fines grew like snowballing threats rolling downhill. The absurdity was exhausting, but the fear was sharper. I had glimpses of what could happen if I slipped even slightly, if I failed to document one moment, if I allowed them to corner me in a legal or social trap. And then came the rumor mill whispers of secret HOA meetings, of a plan to force me out or publicly shame me, of neighbors aligned like conspirators in a drama I hadn't signed up for. The tension became almost unbearable, like a pressure cooker building to an inevitable explosion, where every minor interaction could ignite a new confrontation. Sleep became a precious commodity, as my mind spun with strategies. Ways to protect my home, ways to anticipate their next move. Each night I lay awake imagining scenarios that were becoming increasingly likely: gate access demands, surprise inspections, and the looming possibility of a public spectacle designed to humiliate me. And then, the unthinkable: a notice appeared on my door detailing an upcoming HOA inspection, specifically referencing security measures and gate access, implying that refusal could be considered a violation serious enough to involve legal action. My heart sank. This wasn't a garden variety petty fight anymore. It was a meticulously planned escalation designed to intimidate, to push boundaries, to test how far I would bend before breaking. I realized that the real power the HOA wielded wasn't in the bylaws themselves, but in the fear they could instill, the isolation they could create, and the relentless psychological pressure that made even the simplest decisions feel dangerous. Every knock, every note, every casual remark from neighbors now carried weight, loaded with unspoken threats. And yet, amidst the stress, a strange clarity emerged. I began to understand the dynamics at play, the subtle alliances, the obsessive adherence to trivial rules, the hunger for control that drove the board and certain neighbors. I realized that the conflict wasn't merely about my gate or a bush or a mailbox. It was about asserting dominance, about turning a community into a stage where obedience was enforced and resistance punished. That knowledge steeled me, giving me the focus to prepare, to gather evidence, and to anticipate their next moves. But even with preparation, the tension mounted with every day, every interaction, every alert from my security system, each one reminding me that the climax of this struggle was rapidly approaching. And just when I thought I had anticipated every angle, a new development arrived that changed the stakes entirely. A seemingly innocuous email from the HOA board, signed with official authority, that hinted at consequences I couldn't yet fully comprehend. It was the quiet before the storm, the moment when everything I had endured, the fines, the surveillance, the petty rules, the threats, was about to converge into an explosive confrontation that neither I nor the HOA would forget. The countdown had begun, and nothing in that neighborhood would ever feel normal again. The tension that had been building for weeks finally snapped on a crisp Tuesday morning. The kind of day where sunlight should feel warm, but instead cast everything in stark, unforgiving clarity. I had prepared for this moment for as long as I could remember, armed with every document, every recording, every photograph that captured the petty tyranny of the HOA and the obsessive interference of certain neighbors. My heart pounded as I watched a small convoy of vehicles turn into the cul-de-sac, black SUVs with tinted windows. The kind of ominous presence you'd expect from a corporate raid rather than a neighborhood board inspection. I knew what they wanted: my gate code, immediate compliance, the surrender of control over my own property. As they approached, the neighbor who had first demanded access stepped out of the lead car. Her posture rigid, a thin smile playing on her lips, as if she already imagined victory. But I was ready. I met her gaze without flinching, signaling that I wouldn't give her the satisfaction of fear. They presented their notices, printed on thick paper, with embossed HOA logos, each line dripping with legalese designed to intimidate. Immediate access is required, one board member declared, voice sharp, a forced calm that barely concealed the glee in his eyes. I handed them copies of every letter they had sent me, every email, every surveillance note, and even the time-stamped alerts from my security system, showing their own failed attempts to enter my property. The air was thick, each moment stretching into an eternity, as they flipped through pages, glancing at each other with flickers of disbelief and frustration. Then came the neighbor's attempt to physically approach the gate, reaching for the keypad with the same confidence that had terrified me weeks earlier. I calmly reminded her that any attempt to bypass my security system without authorization was not only a violation of privacy, but could constitute trespassing under state law. Her smile faltered, and the color drained from her face just slightly, a crack in the armor of superiority they had all worn so effortlessly. The tension ratcheted higher when one of the board members suggested a surprise enforcement action, implying they could call the police to force entry if I continued to resist. My pulse spiked, adrenaline sharpening every sense, and I realized that this was the moment I had been preparing for. The apex of the harassment, the test of my patience, and the ultimate stage to turn the tables. I calmly reached into my folder and pulled out a meticulously compiled evidence packet highlighting the absurd fines, the repeated threats, and their own security breaches. Then, with steady voice, I began to recount, step by step, the intrusions, the petty complaints, and the outright intimidation tactics. The tone in the air shifted subtly, like the first ripple before a storm. They had expected a flustered homeowner, someone who would tremble and comply. Instead, I delivered facts, timestamps, and photographic proof that their obsession with control had crossed every boundary imaginable. A murmur ran through the small crowd of neighbors who had gathered quietly to witness the scene. Some sympathetic, some unsure of what to do, all now watching the scripted power dynamic crumble in real time. When I revealed the security footage showing the 3 unauthorized attempts to access my gate, the reaction was almost cinematic. The neighbor who had demanded access first froze mid-step, eyes darting between the camera feed and the board members, searching for some way to justify what had happened, only to realize there was nothing. No clause, no bylaw, no loophole that could excuse their overreach. The board members shifted uneasily, their forced authority visibly shaking as I outlined the potential legal ramifications for each violation they had committed in the guise of enforcing community standards. I could feel the tide turning, the aura of untouchable control that had hovered over the neighborhood for months was cracking, replaced by confusion, fear, and the dawning realization that they had underestimated me. A particularly pompous member attempted to regain control, raising his voice and citing obscure passages from the bylaws about community access and safety compliance. I calmly countered with the exact language from the bylaws, highlighting the sections they had ignored or twisted, and then laid out how their previous actions directly contradicted their own regulations. The smugness drained from his face, replaced by a stiff tension that betrayed a growing awareness. Their power over me was evaporating in plain sight. The neighbor, realizing the legal leverage had shifted, made one last attempt to save face, accusing me of hostility and non-cooperation. I let the accusation hang in the air, then pointed out, matter-of-factly, that every communication they had initiated had been aggressive, invasive, and often contradictory. The irony was impossible to ignore, and even some of the spectators let out quiet, almost imperceptible exhalations of disbelief, the subtle acknowledgement of injustice they had witnessed for weeks. But the climax truly hit when I revealed my final, decisive counter-move. I had already consulted a property lawyer, compiled a formal complaint to the state's HOA oversight office, and scheduled a public hearing that would expose every abusive tactic, every petty fine, and every attempt to coerce access under threat. The room went almost silent, the oppressive weight of the board's supposed authority collapsing under the reality of legal scrutiny. Even the neighbor's smile had vanished entirely, replaced by a tight-lipped, angry tension that betrayed both fear and humiliation. They had spent months believing that I could be manipulated, intimidated, and coerced, and now they were confronted with the truth. The power they wielded was meaningless without accountability. I could see the calculations in their eyes, the rapid reassessment of strategy, the desperate attempts to regain composure, but it was too late. The evidence, the witnesses, and the looming legal consequences had shifted the balance irrevocably. For the first time in weeks, I felt a surge of vindication and empowerment. The anxiety that had plagued me, the sleepless nights, the constant second-guessing of my every action, all of it crystallized into a moment of unshakable confidence. I didn't shout or lash out. Instead, I allowed the weight of truth and preparation to speak for itself, letting the absurdity and illegitimacy of their actions hang in the air like an unshakable verdict. The neighbor, flustered and unable to respond, retreated to the shadows of the gathered crowd, a cautionary lesson etched into her posture. The board members, now visibly rattled, muttered amongst themselves, their attempts at authority reduced to weak protests that fell on deaf ears. The scene, tense and electric, felt suspended in time, a surreal theater of justice where the tables had been turned completely, yet the resolution was still dangling, just out of reach, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. The moment was a turning point, not only for me, but for the neighborhood itself. An undeniable demonstration that unchecked power, even when cloaked in bylaws and community authority, could be confronted and dismantled with preparation, courage, and unyielding resolve. And as the final murmurs of the board died down, as the neighbor slunk away, and the crowd dispersed, I stood at my gate, the security system silently vigilant, realizing that the battle had reached its peak, but the story was far from over. The anticipation of what came next, the legal repercussions, the community fallout, the ultimate vindication, hung like a charged cloud in the air, leaving one question unanswered, one suspenseful moment suspended. After everything they had tried, would the HOA ever recover from the exposure of their own absurdity? Or had they just set themselves up for a public reckoning that would echo through every street of our supposedly peaceful neighborhood? The aftermath of the confrontation with the HOA and my overzealous neighbor unfolded slowly, like a storm receding but leaving traces of chaos in its wake. In the days immediately following the showdown at my gate, the tension in the neighborhood was palpable, though different now. No longer driven by fear, but by the lingering uncertainty of what had just occurred. Conversations that had once been casual greetings across trimmed hedges were now heavy with whispered speculation. Neighbors who had witnessed the exchange at my property approached, cautiously, curious but wary, some offering quiet congratulations, others eyeing me with suspicion, unsure where I stood in the new social balance of power. The board, meanwhile, retreated into a defensive shell. Meetings that had once been procedural displays of authority became tense, truncated gatherings where every word was measured, and the energy that had once projected control now betrayed self-consciousness. Letters demanding compliance, once delivered with an air of inevitable consequence, dwindled to formal, polite inquiries, lacking the previously aggressive undertones. It became clear that their previous attempts to intimidate had backfired, not just on me, but on their own credibility within the community. The legal angle I had initiated gained momentum quietly yet steadily. My lawyer, armed with the meticulous records of correspondence, security footage, and photographic evidence, filed a formal complaint to the state's HOA oversight office, highlighting repeated harassment, violations of privacy, and arbitrary enforcement of minor rules. The oversight office responded promptly, requesting clarifications, and eventually scheduling an official review of the board's practices. The knowledge that an impartial authority would examine their actions cast a shadow over every future interaction with the board. While the process was technical and bureaucratic, each step reinforced my position, establishing that the board's authority was not absolute, and that homeowners retained rights that could be invoked when rules were applied selectively or abusively. Within the neighborhood, the shift in power dynamics became increasingly apparent. The neighbor who had first demanded my gate code, once emboldened by the board's favor, became noticeably cautious, avoiding unnecessary interactions and gradually retreating from her previous displays of dominance. Rumors about her special access faded, replaced by polite distance, as the realization set in that her attempts at control had been publicly undermined. Other neighbors, who had previously toed the line, whispering complaints or nodding along with board dictates, began to reassess their positions. Some reached out to me privately, expressing relief that someone had confronted the overreach they had quietly resented but felt powerless to oppose. Small gestures, friendly waves, invitations to coffee, even subtle acknowledgments of solidarity, began to reconstruct the social fabric, now infused with a renewed sense of personal agency. One of the most surprising consequences was the effect on the board itself. Internal divisions, long suppressed by the illusion of control, surfaced as members questioned each other's judgment, debated the wisdom of previous fines, and reconsidered the aggressive enforcement tactics they had championed. The review by the oversight office added pressure, forcing them to reconcile their actions with official expectations of fairness and legality. The cumulative effect was a board more cautious, measured, and ultimately constrained by external accountability. Their previous authority, once taken as an unquestionable given, became a function of perception, increasingly moderated by the potential consequences of overreach. On a personal level, the experience transformed how I viewed my home, my community, and the concept of power itself. I had entered the conflict expecting minor irritation, perhaps a few fines, maybe some awkward interactions with neighbors, but I emerged with a profound understanding of the delicate balance between individual rights and collective authority. I realized that power in a community, when exercised without accountability, can quickly become oppressive. Yet, when confronted with preparation, evidence, and calm resolve, it can be checked and redirected. My relationship with my property also shifted. The gate that had been a simple security measure became a symbol of boundaries and personal sovereignty, a reminder that even in a tightly controlled environment, one could assert control and maintain safety. The experience reinforced the importance of documentation, vigilance, and the courage to stand firm, not out of stubbornness, but out of principle. The broader impact on the neighborhood extended beyond the immediate conflict. The HOA, once viewed as an unassailable arbiter of community standards, faced increased scrutiny. Residents began paying closer attention to notices, questioning ambiguous directives, and seeking clarification before compliance. A culture of passive acceptance gave way to a more engaged, informed community, where homeowners were aware of their rights and the potential for procedural fairness. Informal networks of support emerged. Neighbors who had previously felt isolated discovered common ground in shared experiences of petty enforcement or intrusive oversight. The discourse around HOA authority became less about fear and more about accountability, transparency, and mutual respect. The conflict also reshaped perceptions of community engagement. What had once been framed as a harmonious neighborhood, free of disruption, was now understood as a living, complex social environment where active participation, assertiveness, and informed dialogue were necessary to maintain balance. The emphasis shifted from blind compliance to conscious negotiation, from passive acceptance to proactive involvement. Social cohesion, once threatened by secrecy and unilateral authority, began to strengthen as residents realized the importance of communication and collective awareness. Over time, some board members adapted constructively, moderating their approach, involving homeowners in discussions, and re-evaluating rules that had been applied rigidly or arbitrarily. Others resisted, but the external oversight and heightened vigilance of the community limited their ability to act unilaterally. The dynamic balance of influence within the neighborhood shifted, creating a precedent. Attempts to overreach could be challenged, and rules, no matter how petty, were subject to scrutiny. On a deeper, emotional level, the resolution of this conflict instilled a sense of empowerment that transcended the specifics of my property or the immediate dispute. The months of tension, fear, and relentless observation had tested resilience, patience, and strategic thinking. Navigating the conflict required not only knowledge of bylaws and security protocols but also emotional discipline. Resisting provocation, maintaining composure under scrutiny, and asserting boundaries without aggression. That personal growth, the realization that one could defend their rights calmly and decisively, became an enduring takeaway. It also reinforced a broader perspective. That community structures, even when designed for collective benefit, can be manipulated or enforced unfairly, and that individuals are not powerless. Action, preparation, and clarity can restore balance. The experience reshaped my sense of justice and fairness, highlighting the subtle, often invisible ways authority can be wielded, and the importance of vigilance in maintaining personal autonomy. The neighborhood itself, while recovering from the tension, seemed to carry a collective memory of the confrontation. Stories of the incident circulated quietly, serving as cautionary tales and, for some, inspiration. New residents were subtly reminded of the balance of power, the expectations of compliance, and the limits of authority. The social landscape, previously dominated by unchallenged board decisions, now incorporated an undercurrent of awareness that would persist for years. This shift had practical consequences. Fines and enforcement actions were now issued with greater care. Residents felt more confident in questioning ambiguous directives, and the culture of fear or quiet compliance eroded. The long-term outcome was not simply the resolution of a personal dispute. It was a transformation of community norms, an adjustment in how authority, compliance, and homeowner rights were perceived and enacted. Personally, I continued to monitor communications and maintain records, not out of paranoia, but out of learned prudence. The vigilance that had once been a response to harassment became a proactive tool for ensuring fairness, protecting my family, and participating meaningfully in community life. The process of engaging with the Oversight Office, attending hearings, and clarifying the scope of HOA authority deepened my understanding of legal rights, administrative procedures, and the mechanisms by which one can hold organizations accountable. In retrospect, the confrontation at the gate was not an isolated event, but a catalyst for growth, awareness, and long-term change. It underscored the delicate balance between individual autonomy and collective governance, the potential for abuse within structured authority, and the power of preparation, evidence, and composure in confronting intimidation. The experience also illuminated the subtleties of neighborly relations, the ways social dynamics can reinforce or challenge institutional authority, and the importance of clear boundaries and personal sovereignty in maintaining both safety and dignity. And while the immediate threat had passed, the lesson lingered. Authority is never absolute, and the willingness to assert one's rights can reshape not only individual outcomes, but also the broader social and institutional landscape. The ultimate takeaway, the lingering thought as I stood once again by my gate, watching the neighborhood settle into a tentative calm, was simple yet profound. Systems of power, whether in small communities or larger organizations, rely on perception as much as structure. When perception shifts, when individuals refuse to be intimidated, when evidence and reason are brought to bear, those systems can be held accountable, challenged, and redirected. I had entered this conflict expecting minor annoyances, but I emerged with a deeper understanding of justice, resilience, and the importance of standing firm. Not aggressively, but unflinchingly, in defense of what is rightfully yours. As the neighborhood returned to a quieter rhythm, as hedges remained trimmed, but rules were now applied with scrutiny, and as the gate stood secure under my control, one thought lingered in my mind, a question that resonates far beyond the confines of this particular street. How often do we accept authority without challenge, and what might change if we dared to assert our rights with courage, clarity, and conviction? The story of that gate, of those letters, of the surveillance alerts and confrontations, became more than a tale of HOA absurdity. It became a testament to the power of vigilance, preparation, and unwavering resolve. It was a reminder that even in a world structured by rules, bureaucracy, and social pressures, one person's steadfast commitment to fairness and autonomy can ripple outward, reshaping a community, altering perceptions, and leaving a legacy that endures far beyond a single dispute. In the end, the gate was no longer just a barrier to entry. It was a symbol, a silent sentinel of both security and empowerment, standing as a quiet declaration that rights, once asserted thoughtfully and persistently, are never easily stripped away, and that the courage to defend them can transform not only your life, but the very neighborhood around you.